Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can join by going to preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, a publisher of regional books as well as the Coinery. He has written over 1,000 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim is on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees and also serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission. He is also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is a series of talks titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 22. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
And I thought it was 23, but who counts? I think we'll be done at 11 or 12, I think is what we figured originally. We're picking it up this time with the H.P. Law Company. Hanspeter Long, as far as I know, the name was pronounced, was born in Germany, came to Davenport, Iowa, in the United States in 1869, and later in the year, August or October, not sure which, came to Lincoln and started a little candy store at about 11th and O. By 1882, what had turned into the building in the upper right-hand corner of the picture was doing about $250,000 a year in business and added beer wholesaling and soda water as well. So he did very well, very quickly. In 1893, he joined a man by the name of W.C. Mills in establishing the Lincoln Drug Company. They operated out of a building which was on the northwest corner of 8th and P Streets, which we know today as the Oven Restaurant and the Candy Factory. He then, after a fire occurred in that building and about 2/3 of the building burned down, he moved directly to the north in the same block and opened a building at 8th and Q Streets. Famous today, if you look at it, I think we still have part of the water tower up there, which was once painted as a coffee can for Milady Coffee, which was one of the things that they actually roasted right on the property. In 1951, it was purchased by he purchased the Raymond Brothers Company, which is another wholesale grocer. Lincoln was dotted with large wholesale grocery firms at this point in history. In 1953, that business was consolidated with the Archie Fur Wholesale Grocery Company out on West O Street. Those buildings are still there pretty much. They were then acquired by a company called Nash Finch, which was acquired by Sunmart. Sort of sounds like a bank, doesn't it? Sunmart is still in business, and they're doing sales now of about $5 billion a year. So the business has obviously gotten larger through time. Roper's Mortuary, and I'm not sure we didn't cover part of this in a much earlier program, or it may have been in University Place, I can't remember. History just keeps marching on. Charles Roper moved to University Place, Nebraska, when it was a separate city in 1901, and there he partnered with a man by the name of Clark Beechner. They were located on the southwest corner of 50th and Layton at that point in history as a mortuary. He moved later downtown to 124 South 13th Street in order to be on a streetcar line. He thought it was essential that the mortuary be on a streetcar line, and the streetcar line, of course, went out to to Wyuka Cemetery on O Street. 1903, one of the partners sold out. Mr. Beechner sold out to a band by the name of Castle. It became Castle, Roper, and Matthews. I think the building shows that up in the stonework at the top. Yeah, Castle, Roper, and Matthews. And yes, I know I can look over here, but the picture's much smaller and I can't see what it says. Jack Matthews joined, and then it became Castle, Roper, and Matthews who did that. In 1906, they purchased a horse-drawn ambulance and became one of the first ambulance services in the city of Lincoln. 1911, they built at 1319 N Street, and that's the building we see here with the terracotta front on it. At that point in time, they added in the back part of the building, on the alley, horse stalls, and included in that was a horse wash. I don't know whether it's where you put quarters in the slot and ran the horse through or not, but they advertised that they had a horse wash, and also they put in the telephone in 1911. 1912, the horses didn't last long. They were retired at that point in time, and they became the first motorized ambulance service in the city of Lincoln. And of course, that at that point, for many, many years, many decades, the mortuaries ran the ambulance as well as private businesses. 1927, Mr. Castle died, and Mr. Roper bought out Jack Matthews. Jack did very well in other businesses as well. Then in 1928, they opened a satellite in Havelock. The building is still there in the Schmidt building. 1957, they moved out of this building we see here, out to O Street, roughly 4300 O Street, where they still exist today. And I asked Tom Roper some years ago, I have a picture of, but we don't have it here, of their very ubiquitous horse-drawn hearse, which was glass-sided, and I know you've seen pictures of them. I asked him about what became of it. He says, we still have it. And I said, then, in fact, if I wanted to, I could still have a funeral. I could have a burial plot in Wyuka, which they're literally adjacent to, and could have a horse-drawn cemetery procession down to the to Wyuka. And he said, absolutely, if you're willing to pay for it, we can provide it. That hearse, I think, is stored out in Seward someplace, if indeed they still have it. But at any rate, it's an interesting thing that could still exist. Went backwards, upside down. There we go. The Shrine Temple, which is on the National Register. Scottish Rite Temple, sometimes called. 1885, what was known as Delta Lodge Number 4 was chartered. And they met at that time in Masonic Hall, which was on roughly 11th and M Streets. The building on the corner was the Masonic Temple. And technically, next door to the north was a 3-story building, which was the was the Shrine Temple. But they moved back and forth. The building on the corner is the one that had the large clock tower on it. I think we talked about that last month, or perhaps a month before, when the city library moved into it. And then in 1889, that building pretty much burned to the ground. They then moved back to their building right directly next door on 11th Street to the north, which was a rather interesting building with oriel or bay windows in the front, and kind of a neat building, which was later torn down for a beautiful gravel street-level parking lot. 1889, after the fire, they then moved the Scottish Rite Temple to the Farmers and Merchants Bank, which was at 15th and O Streets on the southeast corner of the street. And that's that half a block long building, which is about 50 foot deep and 5 stories tall, which always looks like it could easily blow over in a good wind, but stood there for a good long time until a federal parking garage was built in its place. When they left the Farmers and Merchants Bank building, they moved to the Weber block, which was again right next door to the Masonic Temple. Then in 1915, they purchased lots, which were empty except for a house at that time, on the northeast corner of 15th and L. Davis and Burlinghoff, the architects of the building, which is extant at that point in time, was completed in 1917 by the Olson Construction Company, considered new classical revival. Although if you ask 6 architects, you're apt to get 4 different designations of what exactly a building is. It's always interesting to see. And I don't know exactly how you would define neoclassical revival, but that's supposedly what the architecture is. 1923, this building, they added an east wing to the building, and as I said, it is on the National Register of Historic Places. Right next door to it, of course, they tore down the old Burr Mansion, which became their parking lot, and a spectacular building that was as well. Ben Simons and Sons, kind of an interesting business in that sometimes Ben Simons and Sons existed as a corporation and a business, but it was not owned by the Simons, so it's kind of difficult to trace its origins. But Ben Simon himself was born in 1899 in Germany, and the family moved to Washington, Kansas. There we go. I think I must have gone the wrong direction again, John. Good thing somebody keeps up to date with me. Okay. They did have a lot of buildings. This is only one of their buildings. I have no idea what what I pictured before. I didn't look up carefully. At any rate, he moved to Washington, Kansas. Then in 1903, Ben Simon moved to the city of Lincoln. He moved to the city because he knew of the University of Nebraska and the religious diversity that he thought the city offered him and his family. He partnered with a man by the name of Herman Spear, who was from Crete, Nebraska, and started Spear and Simon. They were at that time on the northeast corner of 10th and O Streets in a rather large building called the Daylight Store on the site of the old Sweet and Brock Bank building, which we started talking about probably a couple of years ago in this series. A large, very nice stone 3 or 4 story building called Spear and Simon. By 1922, Ben Simon thought that the store could not support himself and his 4 sons, Joe, Sam, and Charles. So that's 3 of the 4. The 4th one did not enter the clothing business. So at that time, they purchased Armstrong Clothiers, which was located on O Street between 12th and 13th on the, I think I'm going a little back feed there, on the south side of the street, which would put it directly to the west of Miller and Payne's building at that point in time. So for a while they operated Armstrong Clothing, and for a while Spear and Simon existed at 10th and O without a Simon connection at all. They just kept the name, and for a time Simon's kept the Armstrong name, so it gets very confusing and hard to trace. 1928, Ben Simon passed away, and at that point in time the firm, Ben Simon and Sons, had 100 employees, so it had grown considerably through the years. 1939, this building will be torn down, and Miller and Payne will build a 5-story building adjacent to their 8-story building, and they will lease it then to Ben Simons and Sons, which is at that time primarily Sam and Joe and Charles. 1970s, they moved out of this building and over into the atrium, which is the building directly to the south, but in the same block. Miller and Payne took over the old Ben Simon and Sons building on O Street, and expanded and expanded. Unfortunately, at a time when they were almost ready to start shrinking in size. 1980s, they moved to Gateway and started a store there. And it was at that point in time, Harry Simon had always said that Simon's would never be open on Sunday. And as soon as they moved to Gateway, one of the things that's required in their lease out there was that they had to be open on Sunday. So I mentioned to Harry, I said, what happened to never open on Sunday? And Harry said, change that to never say never. And of course, you have to roll with the times. They also had, at that point in time, Westroads Shopping Center in Omaha. And in Grand Island, they went into the Conestoga Mall. Later, they relocated from the Atrium building into South Point, which unfortunately has been the death of several Lincoln businesses. A very high rent, and tastes were changing, and ultimately they went completely out of business. Rob Simon, Bob Simon's son, is the Simon that's left in Lincoln, and he's now a professor of business at the University of Nebraska. So we still see the Simon name around. I think we're going in the right direction now. In 1902, David E. Thompson wanted to promote a friend of his for the presidency, and his friend was a man by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. He did so, and in order to help promote the presidency, he established a newspaper in the city of Lincoln called the Lincoln Star. It's really its primary, and if not its only thrust, was to elect Roosevelt, and it worked. At that time, they were located in what was called the Bohannon Building, which was a large building on the southeast corner of 11th and M. They built, you can see to the right in this picture, you can't see their original building. The original building that they built on the site of the Bohannons is now a beauty salon or beauty school. I think it's Joseph's Beauty School, a 2-story large building. That was originally the Lincoln Star building. Then later they'll move in the same block up to the building we see here directly to the east at 12th and M. So they moved from 11th and M to 12th and M. 1929, the property had been purchased by Herbert Gooch a few years earlier than that. And he changed it. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. The rest of the Roosevelts were Democrats. So it was a Republican paper in 1902, 1903. And then Herbert Gooch purchased the paper from them in order to turn it from a Republican newspaper into a Democrat newspaper in 1929. Unfortunately, the Great Depression interfered, and Mr. Gooch, this is Gooch's Mill, the same Gooch, he sold the property, the newspaper, to Lee Enterprises in Davenport, Iowa, and of course they own it to this day. In 1952, the Lincoln Journal and the Lincoln Star had already been experimenting, and they combined several of their departments early on. They started combining before 1952. They first combined their advertising departments and their sports departments. So there was only one sports editor for two separate newspapers. Hard to think of them as absolutely two separate newspapers, but here the Star is located on M, and the Journal is located over at that point in history at 9th and P Streets. So they operated absolutely as two different newspapers. The Star agreed shortly after that to become the morning newspaper, and the Journal agreed to become the evening newspaper. And I'm sure that Joe Sechrest's thought was, who's going to want just a morning newspaper? So we'll keep the big circulation, the evening newspaper. Well, who knew that TV was going to literally take over the news business? So that flips, and the morning paper becomes predominant. But in the meantime, the Lincoln Journal and the Lincoln Star, still two completely separate entities except for the sports department, only one sports editor, and the advertising department. In fact, if we wanted to buy an ad in just the Star, it cost extra. We could buy it in the Star and the Journal for a better price than either the Star separate or the Journal. Very peculiar. But then in 1952, both separate corporations formed a third corporation called the Journal-Star Printing Company. So those two newspapers went together and established a printing company. That became the Journal-Star Printing Company, but you can tell the difference because it has the hyphen in the middle. So the Journal-Star Printing Company then later will build on a square block directly to the north of the Journal newspaper building, and it's still there. About 1964, Campus Bookstore was purchased by Nebraska Bookstore. In about 1964, they will have about 125 stores nationwide. Then, at that point in time, he will change it from the Co-op Bookstore to the Campus Bookstore. Charlie Wins became the manager, and the last manager was a man by the name of Stan Lennertz, who went to KLIN Radio and then to Grand Island. This house, Johnny also, Nebraska Book, Johnny Johnson also bought the house to the left, which would be to the south in this picture, and used the upper part as rental property, and then dug a tunnel under this store over to that, and they used the house for storage as well. Most of the students at the University of Nebraska pictured them as two separate businesses, Campus Bookstore and Nebraska Bookstore. I knew students at that time who they would go to Campus Bookstore and buy their books because they didn't want to support that huge Nebraska Book Company down the street at 1135. Not realizing it was the same ownership. And if you watched carefully, back and forth down the alley would go bucket loads of carts of books back and forth constantly. Some people went to Nebraska Bookstore rather than Campus Bookstore for whatever reason. The building was ultimately razed along with the building to the left. The house was torn down, and also Johnny Johnson had built directly to the west of this. He had purchased, I should say, a three-story building, which was Cotner University. And Cotner University, which we talk about being in Bethany, Nebraska, and later on Holdridge Street, slowly began to grow and come back to its former glory. And they moved into and built the brick and stone building, which was directly between the Temple building and Campus Bookstore. Johnny Johnson bought that and turned it into a more or less what we'll call a private museum, where he was going to display some of his books and art and so forth. But in the interim, Johnny passed away. And at that point in time, Nebraska Book Company sold the old Cotner College building and Campus Book and the house next door. All three were torn down, and it became the site of the Ross Theater, so right on that corner. Coryells. Well, the Coryell family is an interesting one. Richard Coryell came to Nebraska probably about 1869, something like that. He was born in New York in 1836 and moved to Nemaha County in 1867. Then in 1869, he began building near Brock, Nebraska, on the old family farmstead. And for a while, the family, after they moved to Nebraska, lived in the covered wagon that they came west on. At that point in time, L.L. Coryell was born. Levi L. Coryell was born in that property. Then in the 1930s, he moved to the city of Lincoln. He built apartments, several. The ones that are still standing that I think of instantly are the Ambassador and the President, which are directly to the west of the Capitol building. But he had a large number of apartments around the city of Lincoln. He was also what I would call a sort of a entrepreneur on a horizontal level and also on a vertical level, because as he built businesses, he realized that other businesses were associated with them, and he would start associated businesses to complement the businesses which were going. So with the building of the apartment houses, he built a large lumber yard, and that lumber yard was located out on Cornhusker Highway. The lumberyard grew, and last I knew, parts of it might still be there. If you know where Virginia's Travelers Cafe is, this almost became the village of Coryell. He built that building where Virginia's is. Behind it was a large lumberyard, and later he built to the east of that a two-story building, long brick and stone building called the Coryell Building, which all of these things had his various businesses in them. And as he operated, as I said, one business, he would add another business. Along the way, he noticed that one of his other businesses was buying a lot of chicken and eggs. So he started a huge hatchery business out in what I'll call the city of Coryell. It was not a city or even a village, but he just began adding and adding and adding things out there. His primary business was probably at that point in time, however, petroleum. He had started a few gas stations along with another relative by the name of Earl Coryell. And Earl Coryell had primarily ended up with the retail filling stations. The most prominent one was on N Street, directly across the street west from the Lincoln City Libraries today, on that northwest corner of what would be 14th and N Streets. That was one of Earl Coryell's properties. His office was in the 15th floor of the Shrike Building, and that's the picture we see here. He and his son, also L.L. Coryell, but not, he was Leland instead of Levi, so L.L. Coryell and L.L. Coryell Jr. Had a partner's desk, something which has kind of gone away, but it was a huge double desk which they faced each other. And L.L. Sr. was very controlling and very, very conservative. For example, he was very much a temperance advocate, let me put it that way, and son, L.L. Jr., was not, okay? And we'll kind of leave that floating there. They lived, Jr. lived on Sheridan Boulevard, and the father lived a block away to the north. And he was very controlling, the father was. Every morning before they both left separately for work, they would call each other and tell them what the other one was going to wear, so that they both wore brown shoes. They both wore whatever colored shirt, or so that they were the same. Every morning when they got there, they had a fresh carnation in their lapels. And being very conservative, every Monday, L.L. Coryell Sr. had hired a Lincoln minister to put on a little sermonette, if you will, on Monday mornings before they opened for business. Very, very closely held company. Took up the entire 15th floor of that building. And one of the things he realized that as he had filling stations was that he was buying gasoline at wholesale. So he started a refinery. And after he built the refinery, he realized that he was buying crude oil. So he started buying oil wells in Kansas. And then this is where I talked about him being rather horizontal or vertical, depending on how you want to look at it. He also bought a company of barges which shipped petroleum around. Then he bought a huge company which did nothing but testing of petroleum and gasoline. So those businesses kind of one bloomed into the next one. By the 1930s, he also, along with his wife, decided to take the original homestead near Brock, Nebraska, and turn it into a park. I'm sure some of you probably heard of or even visited Coryell Park, which still exists today. They took all of the original buildings and pretty much did away with the early ones, but they built a chapel, which was designed by Mrs. Coryell, and the building was built to stand the test of time. The walls were 24 to 28 inches thick of stone, and of course you can still visit it. The roof was of slate, stained glass and beveled glass windows. It was specially made in the city of Lincoln. And the park covered 26 acres, so literally the entire original homestead was there. They built shelters. They built a singing tower, which would be kind of a electronically played carillon tower. A treasure house, which they displayed their various things that they collected all over the world in. A doll collection that belonged to Mrs. Coryell, which I often, when I visited there as a kid, I thought, how on earth can they secure this? But nonetheless, it existed. They built a large auditorium, and it became a go-to place for weddings all over this corner of the state of Nebraska and all over the United States. People would come and be married there. 1940, they turned the entire property over for about 10 weeks each summer to a camp for diabetic girls. I was thinking ahead. Ultimately, when both Coryells passed away, and one of the daughters married a man by the name of Hall, and moved to Kansas City, of course, as Hall Mark and Hall Department Store and so forth. That's one of the Coryell daughters. The properties ultimately, the park and the apartment buildings and so forth ended up in the ownership of the Lincoln Foundation. To the best of my knowledge, that foundation operates the park and has pretty much sold off, I think, all of the apartment houses in the city of Lincoln. So a huge business, which, another picture of the office, but kind of uninteresting. One of the interesting things about Coryell, too, was that every summer he took all of his employees, of which there were a goodly number in the office, and they had all drove their cars to work one morning in summer, and they completely surrounded that block, 13th and N, and then he took the whole smash to Colorado, and they operated the business in Colorado over the summer, and then they would convoy back in the fall and set up back again in the Sharp Building. 1945, a lady in Lincoln by the name of Maxine Sunderman Runcie, R-U-N-C-I, started a doll hospital. She had graduated from the Chicago Art Institute, and at that point in time, while operating the doll hospital, sculpted a model of a doll after her daughter. Didn't really do much with it, but showed it to her aunt, whose name was Violet Gradwell. And of course, the Gradwells become very prominent in the city, physicians, attorneys, judges, and so forth, that family. Violet convinced her to produce a sample of the doll and take it to the Toy Fair in New York City. They got such a good reception for the doll that they decided to go back in Lincoln and produce the doll. Gradwell's daughter's nickname was Terry, T-E-R-I, and Violet's maiden name was Lee. So they named the doll Terry Lee. They operated a factory at 2012 O Street, which we see here. This is a large 3-story building, and of course right next door to it later you may remember the building which was torn down about 2 years ago, Ben's Auto Supply Store, which was also a 3 or 4-story building. And you kind of wonder, at least I would have at one point, what these larger 2, 3, 4-story buildings were doing that far east of downtown Lincoln. But we have to look back a little bit before that and realize that the retail section of Lincoln, Nebraska went clear out to about 21st and O Streets. So even where the Greenwich Cafe is, that started as a little department store. Greenwich is long gone, but that was the 20th and O. So these buildings were actually department stores and retail parts of the downtown section of the city of Lincoln, which is going to shrink, where today, if you wanted to buy something at retail in downtown Lincoln, you'd have to go to the Post and Nickel or to Walgreens, and that's kind of it. Everything else has moved out into the suburbs. But at any rate, they had hair, which they purchased from Ben, the hairdresser. Of course, it's Ben that operated later the beauty salon where the Lincoln Star was started. They bought the bodies from the Tip Top Plastic Company in Omaha. And the Tip Top Plastic Company is now gone, but at one point in history, probably in the 1960s, the Tip Top Plastic Company, which was located in the old Ford assembly plant building, where you could go in and order a new Ford, watch it being produced, and drive it away. And there are still a couple of those Fords that they know were built there in the state of Nebraska, and I don't know where any of them are now. But anyway, Tip Top Plastic moved into that building and became one of the largest extruders of plastics in the United States. And they were the largest producer of women's hair products made of plastic, like combs and clips and so forth, and ultimately just went away. But they made the body for the Terry Lee dolls. In 1946, they perfected a contract with Montgomery Ward Company, and one Christmas they sold 8,000 Terry Lee dolls through Montgomery Ward alone for $11.95, which was a good amount of money at that point in time. The picture we see here is taken in 1951, January. The building literally burned down. There were some questions about that at the time, but nothing serious, and no charges were ever filed. It was arson or anything else. It just appeared to be a mysterious fire. At that point, they moved their facilities for production or assembly to 4139 O Street. That building is still there. It's had a rather checkered life. The last thing I knew, there was what did they call it, a bong shop in there, and was periodically closed down by the city of Lincoln. It was Gene's Cost Plus 10 Steakhouse for a while, and the building is still there. They moved there after the fire in 1941. Then in 1952, their primary factory and also their plastic manufacturer moved to California. 1958, that factory burned to the ground under what is termed mysterious circumstances, and this time they're beginning to look a little more closely and ask more questions. And one of their employees was actually charged with arson at that point in time. However, we don't think that the owners of the Terry Lee doll factory had any part in the arson because they had no insurance on the building, so it was a total loss. This land was sold in 1960. And then in 1962, they leased out the rights to manufacture the Terry Lee doll, but we have no idea whether anybody actually did anything with it. But as late as the mid-2010 period, something like that, there was another company that came along was going to, again, reintroduce the Terry Lee doll. And of course, by that time, they had 6 or 8 different designs of Terry Lee dolls. My wife has a Terry Lee doll in its original box, and they're worth considerable amount of money, but long gone from the city of Lincoln. This house stood on the northeast corner of 14th and Q Streets, and it was just a home. Frank Steidles started in Lincoln in 1895, a company which sold bicycles primarily. Then he became bicycles and sporting goods and phonograph players, so he's branching out. 1900, Mr. Seidels will acquire the Cadillac franchise for the city of Lincoln, probably parts of the state of Nebraska. And it's at this point in time that, along with Mr. Stewart, the Seidels will be approached by what was being put together as the General Motors Company. They put together Cadillac, Chevrolet, Buick, who else? Pontiac, Oldsmobile. They put them all together as General Motors. But like a lot of things, their timing was either perfect or not so perfect because the Great Depression is going to interfere. And at that point in time, General Motors comes to Mr. Seidels and Mr. Stewart for financial help. And they agree to underwrite the payroll for General Motors. This is the Seidels and the Stewarts in Lincoln. And at that point in time, they have erected the Nebraska Buick building, which stood on the southeast corner of 13th and P Streets. And it's a 5-story building, large brick building, the Nebraska Buick, because they've obtained at that time not just the Cadillac franchise, but the Buick franchise. Now, after they underwrite the payroll for General Motors, and General Motors obviously not only survives after the Depression, but becomes larger and larger and larger, they want to pay off the loan to Seidels and Stewart. And one of the things that they got instead of a lot of cash was they got a franchise for Buick motor cars. But the franchise was not for Lincoln, and it wasn't for Nebraska. It was for a multi-state, if you will, franchise. Now what that meant was that those Buicks that are sold in all of that area will, on paper, go through a building which they then built on the southwest corner of 13th and Q. And that's a multi-story building which now has an insurance company in it, I think. It's beautifully repainted, and it has its own parking garage with it, and I can't think of the name of that company that's in there. But the building is still there. That's the building that they built. They then tore down, and we'll look at this in a little more detail, they tore down the 5-story Nebraska Buick building at 13th and P, and in its place built the Stewart building. And that property was originally just a house too. That was in the suburbs at that point in time. It was a house. So the Seidels then will build. And by the way, KFOR and KFAB radios were both in that building. KFOR. What does that stand for? Well, Mr. Seidels said it stands for, because you could go to Washington, D.C., and you could pick out whatever letters you wanted as long as they were available. And he picked out KFOR and said that it stands for Keep Following a Buick. Okay, and it's sort of like KOIL in Omaha, which was Marathon Oil Company owned, or WOW, it was the Woodman of the World. And what KFAB stood for, I don't know, unless it was just Fab. I don't know. But at any rate, that's where KFOR supposedly came from. In 1930, they sold 22,000 Buicks through 501 dealers. Now, not all of those Buicks necessarily went through that large building, 6 stories tall, but a good percentage of them went through there on paper. So a little bit of every Buick that went to about 5 states rubbed off on the Seidels and the Stewart Corporation. Seems like there's something else I was going to say. Later on, Nebraska Buick, when they wanted to relocate their wholesale warehouse from over 1135 R Street, before they went out on Cornhusker Highway, they looked at that building, the new Nebraska Buick building, because ultimately the franchise went away. But that building, which is still standing, would not support the weight of books. Cars spread that weight out over a large area, so it was able to support cars. And I can't remember the architecture firm that came in and said, no, we can't do it. Books are too dense, and they wanted to pile them on every floor, 10 feet tall, and it wouldn't support it. So they didn't go in there, and ultimately it became a building of mixed use, and now it's all owned by that one. I think it's an insurance company or a reinsurance company. I'm not absolutely sure. But in the meantime, the Seidels will build this building over on the northeast corner where that house stood. They will build this building for the Buicks. A very interesting building on the outside. It's still there. It's now part of the University of Nebraska. Operates out there. For a while, the University of Nebraska Press was in it. I'm not absolutely sure what departments of the university are in there. This is the general sales floor, which was right on the corner and looked out through that large curved front window. The mural in the back was printed by David Montrose, who came to Lincoln and did a lot of murals, and some of them are in people's basements, and some of their, he did a lot of things. Very few that I know of survive, if any, but he was kind of if an artist, he was kind of an illustrator. And this represented, on the right-hand side was the Statue of Liberty and New York, and then it was a panorama of the United States going clear around to the Golden Gate Bridge. This was so interesting a piece of art that, for example, the art class at Northeast one year took a busload of kids down to see it. So kind of interesting. And of course, it's probably still there and covered up. I really don't know. The building is, as I said, still there. Up on the mezzanine level, which is now completely isolated and you can't see it, there was an apartment and a party room, if you will, where they could have gatherings. And the University of Nebraska Press used it as a room to gather and meet large numbers of people, 20, 30 people in it. So it's still there too, as far as I know. Now in 1894, William Jennings Bryan was still living at 1625 D Street, a house which is still there, by the way. But at that point in time, he became the editor of the Omaha World Herald and actually was living in Lincoln but working at the World Herald as the editor. Unfortunately, they ran an editorial on the front page of the World Herald, which was in support of a Republican candidate. So Mr. Bryan resigned. Now, he was successful at the Omaha World Herald, but resigned at that point in time. 1898, he ran his first campaign unsuccessfully and became known as the Great Commoner at that point in time. 1900, roughly, he ran again for the presidency, was defeated. And at that point in time, he began publishing the Commoner newspaper, if you will. And the Commoner was modeled after an earlier newspaper which J. Sterling Morton had published called The Conservative. The Commoner sold for $1 a year or 5 cents per weekly issue. And it was printed in this building we see right here, which is the Free Press or the Fry Press building, which was on the southwest corner of 13th and N Streets. Their motto was that they would exclude anything objectionable and include anything that was helpful. 1913, the Commoner, still very successful, however, became a monthly newspaper. 1916, Bryan had been appointed the Secretary of State, but as World War loomed on the horizon, he told Mr. Wilson, "Your actions will involve us in war." And Wilson made that famous statement, which went something like, "We will never be at war with Germany," which he probably shouldn't have said out loud. And that was World War I. But at that time, he resigned as Secretary of State and went back to the newspaper, which at that point had a circulation of 140,000. There were a number of newspapers printed within this building, the Free Press building, or Fry Press. 2 or 3 of them were German-speaking. And then during this period of time, too, Lincoln became one of the 2 or 3 largest second-class post offices in the United States. And a second-class post office is one that mailed newspapers. So we had a lot of newspapers published in the city of Lincoln. Many were weekly, but there were probably as many as half a dozen at one point in time of daily newspapers as well. So we were rich in newspapers. 1923, the Commoner ceased publication, and at that point in time, they had 275,000 on their subscription list. Charles Bryan, his brother, had operated at that point in time. And this building, of course, comes down for what's called the Chapin Building 2. Chapin Building number 1 is the Lincoln Electric Building, which is on the southeast corner of 15th and O Streets, next to the library, and a 3-story building that now has, I think, a bar on the ground floor and apartments and condominiums above it. So the Chapin Building will replace this. It will become First Federal, then it will become Tyrone Bank, or I guess that's Tier 1 if you spell it correctly. I'm spelling it the same way. But at any rate, Tier 1 went in it. Then they jacketed this building and the one next door and covered up a couple of great buildings with kind of, well, just a facade. Too bad. And in the background over there, clear on the right-hand side, we can see St. Paul Methodist Church. And on the left, that is the edge of the Lindell Hotel. In 1902, two cousins by the name of Everett and Clinton Cushman built a two-cycle water-cooled portable engine. They were operating at that time in the basement of a building at 24th and O Streets. Then in 1903, just a year later, they established the Cushman Motorworks. 1909, a man by the name of Everett Sawyer working for them developed a farm apparatus which included an engine, and he then bought 2/3 of the stock in Cushman Company. 1913, they began building at 900 North 21st Street. They called their company briefly at that point in time the Easy Manufacturing Company. By 1914, their advertisements said that they were the largest manufacturer of 4-horsepower stationary engines in the world. So if you define something closely enough, you can be the largest in the world, I guess is what that means. During World War I, they converted their engine to a 4-cycle. Then in 1922, J.F. and Charles Ammon from David City built a larger plant at 21st and Y and purchased the Cushman Motorworks. 1934, the Easy Manufacturing Company faded slowly out of existence while the Cushman grew and grew and grew. 1936, they perfected what they called the Auto Glide Motor Scooter, which is kind of, if you're old enough, we remember seeing these putt-putt around on the streets in the city of Lincoln. During World War II, like a lot of manufacturers in the United States, they began manufacturing for the federal government. They manufactured 8.5 millimeter nose cone fuses. So a lot of manufacturers were manufacturing, even in Lincoln, little bits of parts of bombs, little bits of parts of airplanes, and so forth. They built 15,000 motor scooters for the armed forces. A lot of these were used on military bases to move things around, deliveries and people. They built 7,500 motor scooters, which they were designed to drop from airplanes with parachute into primarily France. And they experimented with those. The story goes, there was a large tree next to their building. And they would hoist these scooters up into the tree and then throw them out. Because, of course, dropping 20 or 30 feet would be, even with a parachute, you would still have quite a good impact. And they had a terrible time at first figuring it out, but they finally did figure out how these machines could simply be dropped from an airplane, parachuted to the ground, and immediately got onto and ridden away by troops, as I say, primarily in France. After the war, they developed the Cushman Eagle, which was still a motor scooter or putt-putt, not like a small motorcycle, but a literal putt-putt. They also went into the business of making golf carts, which a lot of us remember, delivery vehicles. The post office department bought thousands of them. Police departments were buying them to service parking meters and so forth. Then in 1957, they merged with something called the Outboard Marine Company. And when you begin to merge with people, they sometimes have slightly different views of how your product should be produced. Outboard Marine in 1989 was purchased by Ransom, R-A-N-S-O-M-E Company. And then 2003, Ransom was purchased by Textron Company. And the Lincoln plant, the buildings were sold all to the University of Nebraska for $4.9 million. And there they sat, a few of them being used for various University of Nebraska storage functions primarily, but very interesting buildings, almost entirely not used, and the parking lots around it were gravelled and used for student parking. In 2015, all of the buildings were razed, including the one we see here, which probably had been surrounded by other buildings in a period of time. And who purchased them? Speedway Properties. Now, if you go down there, you find nothing but ground floor parking, but a lot of it has been paved over, so it's no longer just simply gravelled parking lot. Now we are at the point in time where we truly do have time for questions, if there are any. Maybe we covered them all earlier. That's why I went ahead after the 10-minute. I figured we probably covered a lot of the questions. Nothing at all? We will be back here next month, a week from now. Hopefully, I'll know not to touch certain buttons. And also we'll have this tray has lots and lots of pictures in it, so we won't have that problem again. Okay, thank you.